Good evening and welcome to Q&A. I'm Tony Jones and here to answer your questions tonight, political historian Judith Brett, former Prime Minister Kevin Rudd, who's just released the first volume of his autobiography, political journalist and essayist Laura Tingle, and outspoken Conservative broadcaster Alan Jones. Please welcome our panel. Q&A is live across Australia on ABC TV, iView and News Radio at 9:35 Eastern Daylight Saving Time, and you can stream us around the world on YouTube, Facebook and Periscope. Let's go straight to our first question. It's from Colin Siegel.
Malcolm Turnbull seems to be single-handedly destroying the values of the Liberal Party and what it stands for, right in front of his very own party. Are his team going over the cliff with him? Or do you see a way for Tony Abbott to make a comeback as Malcolm Turnbull is out of his depth as Prime Minister?
Alan Jones, start with you.
Well, I think you got the first part of the question right. Malcolm Turnbull can't possibly win an election, there's no doubt about that, and the polls indicate it. I think that we get things a bit confused here. I mean, the aim in politics, apart from everything else, is to win. You're not worth two bob in opposition. And that poll today is the 22nd poll that Turnbull has lost. He held the fire to the flame for Abbott on 30. The reality is, in the 30 polls that Abbott lost, on 10 of them he had a primary vote of 40 or more. Now, as Kevin would know, you can't win an election with a primary vote of 35. Turnbull has never had a primary vote in those 22 of 40%. If you go to the other end of the scale, and how many of these votes on the news poll have been 35 and below, well, in 30 of those polls, Abbott was only below 35 on 7 occasions. 2 of those were when he got into trouble over the budget, and then 2 of them were when they had a shot at him after 16 polls, and so they were questioning whether he was going to continue as the leader. Turnbull's, this is the 22nd today, 12 of them have had a primary vote of 36 or less. He cannot possibly, the coalition cannot win an election with Turnbull in charge.
So, Alan, you said the question got the first part right, and you've been spelling that out. What about the second part, Tony Abbott coming back?
Well, Tony Abbott won 25 seats from Labor in 2 elections. If you want to win and beat Bill Shorten, you've got to find someone that knows how to win an election. He's done that. 25 seats in 2 elections. He was democratically elected, like Mr Rudd, then stabbed in the back. I don't think people particularly like that. But Turnbull stabbed Peter King in the back to win pre-selection for Woollahra. He then stabbed Brendan Nelson in the back, and he stabbed Tony Abbott in the back. So the Liberal Party have got a choice to make in all of this, and if they don't, to use the image you've used, they're holding their hands together and walking over the cliff.
Just a quick one. Your old mate Graham Richardson today called on Julie Bishop to get a heart and come up and challenge Turnbull. What about Julie Bishop?
Well, I don't care. I mean, the Liberal Party have got to make a decision. Someone's got to have the guts to stand up in the party room and say there's an elephant in the room here. We can't win with this bloke in charge. That's the first thing. Then, who's going to put their hand up? That's up to the party to decide.
Laura Tingle.
Well, I'm going to differ with Alan a little bit here. I'm going to say that I think you got the first bit of the question wrong and the second bit right. I think that's the right way around. Look, is Malcolm Turnbull destroying the Liberal Party, or is Tony Abbott destroying the Liberal Party? I mean, I don't know what the Liberal Party stands for anymore, really. Do you? I mean, it's
well,
a fairly
actually,
confused picture.
Quickly, let's go back to our question and ask, are you actually a coalition voter, first of all?
I have been in the past. I'm not sure what to do now with what's happening with the coalition.
Yeah. So, I mean, do you want to see a challenge to Malcolm Turnbull? Is that what you're saying?
Definitely.
OK, back to Laura.
Yeah. So the question is, if you don't like Malcolm Turnbull, there are 2 things that can happen. One of them is that he can, to be impolite, grow a spine and start saying, well, this is how we're going to lead the country, because that's what people are angry about, that they feel that he is just not leading them, that they're disappointed in what he hasn't done, more than, I think, even what he has done. The next question is, do you think that Tony Abbott can win an election that Malcolm Turnbull can't win? I would argue that he can't, that Tony Abbott is not the answer, that there will not be a change to any other person in a political party unless, like Kevin, the colleagues think that they've got a better chance of winning the election. Nobody in the coalition party room believes that Tony Abbott has a better chance, whatever the historic polling figures are, of winning an election.
Do they think Julie Bishop does?
No. I mean, everybody thinks Julie Bishop is a very competent foreign minister. She's very good at those things, but they haven't been looking to Julie Bishop as an alternative. And in fact, she's got a lot of enemies. I mean, I admire her success in surviving as long as she has through all these leadership changes, but she's created a lot of enemies along the way.
Okay, Kevin Rudd.
Well, fortunately, I live out of the country. I don't really know. So that's true, actually. I'm only here 2 or 3 times a year. I'm president of a think tank in New York. So the beginning of wisdom is to know what you don't know.
It must all sound terribly familiar to you, though.
There are resonances. I think what I'd say is, where I partly disagree with Alan is this, and speaking as a former leader and Prime Minister of a Labor government, is that from our side of the House, when you go into an election, you have to be well and truly in the opinion polls ahead by a sort of 53-47 factor. And that's because there's always a drag back to the Conservatives in the last several days. I saw that in my own election of 2007. We were ahead in the poll, something like 55, 56 in that last week. We came home with just under 53. I saw it in earlier Queensland elections with Wayne Goss, hugely ahead, and then there's a Conservative drag back towards the end. So that's my first caveat, I suppose, I attach to what Alan said before in response to the gentleman's question. I've just been up in Queensland, the People's Republic thereof, in the last few days.
Did you meet Chairperson Palaszczuk?
I met Chairperson Palaszczuk, and Comrade, I said. And that's the last thing you'd say to Anastasia if you know her well. She's a very good person.
Lucky you said that.
But I've had my issues with the Queensland branch. Anyway, but the bottom line is, what struck me is just out and about with folks in the community, and people roll up to you all the time, is I was actually surprised in Queensland about how down people were on Malcolm, really, across the board. People who are running businesses, people who are teachers, people here, people there. I had not encountered that before with previous Conservative leaders. I don't know what he's done to deserve that. I'm simply reporting back from Hustingsland. And the very last thing I'd say is, don't underestimate the capacity also for the massive mismanagement of the National Broadband Network to really inflame people across the country in surprising areas. I was talking to a former National Party minister coming down here today about the impact of broadband in the bush, and this sort of wholesale abandonment of the original broadband model, fibre optic to the premises, to this other mysterious thing called fibre optic to the node, has just made people really angry. And I think that's out there as well. I think Julie could do it, by the way.
Julie Bishop.
Yeah.
What, you'd be backing her as someone who could beat Bill Shorten?
No, you asked me who could possibly replace...
When you said she could do it, I was wondering whether you actually meant she could win an election against Bill Shorten.
I'll do it as opposed to do it. OK, gotcha. No, I mean, my knowledge of the Liberal Party, and I've been an observer of them since the days of John Howard in the Parliament, and obviously before that, but certainly not been around as long as Alan on these questions, is that the Liberal Party that I have seen over the years doesn't go sailing across a cliff. If they conclude the position is irretrievable, then they will act. And at that stage, my experience of the raw, bare-knuckled processes of politics is then sentiment and previous hostilities go out the window, survival comes to the fore.
Correct.
And it'll be whoever is around, in which category I would say Julie may become, sort of the default position. Because I can't see, amongst the other mob, anyone who begins to stack up.
Let's ask Judith Brett about that. And could Julie Bishop
Well, I don't know about that, but I wanted to actually go back to the first thing that Alan said, which is the point of politics is to win. I don't think that's right. I think the point of politics is to win in order to advance certain policies, certain positions, certain values. That is, you win power in order to do things. And I think the real problem with this coalition government is that it's actually had power now for a couple of years and it hasn't done anything much with it.
4.
Yeah, well, 4 years, that's right, and
I
since
remember
the
when it
last
happened.
election. So, and I think the real confusion that a lot of us have is it's not clear what direction the Liberal Party wants to take the government in, because it seems to be divided in itself, and Malcolm Turnbull doesn't seem to have been able to either ignore the right, which has policies that are actually to the right of what public opinion wants. He hasn't used the political capital he's got. I mean, he's going to lose the next election, in my view, but why he may as well. What I haven't been able to understand is why, given that he's likely to lose it, he hasn't actually just gone for broke and got some policies through.
Are you surprised by that? Because of all recent Prime Ministers, you would think he had the least to lose, actually. That's
right. Yeah, well, I'm puzzled by it because he seems to veer between a sort of grandiose optimism and a rather depressed policy paralysis.
Oh, God.
So...
look, honestly, I'll tell you one of the things we haven't discussed here, which is a great weakness, I think, within the Liberal Party. They continue to underestimate Shorten. Now, Shorten's no mug, no political mug. And when he goes out into the supermarkets and in the shopping centres, or when there's a flood-ravaged area, Bill Shorten has a way of resonating with these people. And they actually like those polls are telling us something. Judith, I didn't for one moment imply that you just win power to do nothing with it. You must have certain policy positions, but Turnbull can't articulate any. Abbott, whatever you think about Abbott, he won an election on certain policy positions, and the bedwetters got nervous and Tony went out the door. But if you want to win, you've got to find someone that knows a bit about winning. And I'm a coach, a football coach. I look at the scoreboard and Abbott's got the runs on the scoreboard. I think Abbott can win an election, but Shorten is not to be underestimated.
You do need a fair referee.
We do need a fair referee. We'll go to that, absolutely.
We'll come back to that later. Next question from James Elliott Watson.
My question is to Kevin. On the 7:30 report last week, you said that the state of our democracy is in peril. No Australian Prime Minister has served a full term since your election in 2007. Do you accept that your period in government contributes to Australian cynicism and distrust of modern politics?
I didn't assassinate me, mate. It's kind of a physical impossibility.
But you did come back and assassinate the person who assassinated you. If you want to put it in those terms.
Very elegantly put. Actually, my line to the colleagues at the time was, I'm not touching this unless you, collectively, including Shorten, who was part of the original assassination squad, actually say that this is what the caucus wants in order to save the furniture at what was then the 2013 election. And so I think the answer to your question is, flowing from the events of June of 2010 and the coup, there has been this deeply destabilised period of Australian politics. I think what I put it down to is this. This is not about Labor or Liberals, it's a more generic point. I think what was established that particular night, which surprised me as much as it did most of you, was that we then were beginning to establish new norms and slightly more terrifying norms of political behaviour. And what I began to see, both amongst, let's call it those who had risen through the Liberal ranks, but those who had risen through the Labor ranks, were the first generation of what I'd describe as, in our case, young Labor apparatchiks who had been professional student politicians and then professional politicians working for politicians, and the stagecraft that they'd acquired, which is of student politics, young Labor factional politics. The way to get ahead is to start knifing people. Actually, it moved more from the margins to the centre stage of the way in which the political class, as it were, thought it was normal to operate.
Paul Keating called it the rise of the state secretaries. As they made their way into politics, so along with them came the factional politics that they lived with and died with.
And Factionland was never a big fan of me, nor was I of Factionland. And remember, I emerged against the opposition of most of them, initially as Labor Party leader. So there's something in what Paul says, but it was just the brutality of the use of factional power by factional chieftains, but new factional chieftains who no longer had the tempering influence of the people like, Robert Ray and those folks who came from previous generations and said, just calm down, will you? For God's sake, there's a bump in the opinion polls. We're under by one. Just everyone hold their breath, calm down and move on for a few weeks. We get on with the program. As opposed to the sky's falling in, or here's my opportunity and I'm going to rip for it. So I think that was so dramatic, it kind of changed the culture of the acceptable in terms of the behaviour of young factional apparatchiks.
This is, I guess, this is a bit of a forecast of volume 2 of your autobiography, because
there's 19 volumes actually.
That's what I was worried about. Judith Brett.
I think...
do you buy this? And go back to the question, actually. The question asked whether that period of Rudd-Gillard politics actually changed the dynamic.
I mean, look, I think the other thing that's operating in this period is that we've come to the end of a policy cycle, that neoliberalism isn't working anymore, so that this fighting, if you like, this leadership instability is happening over the top of a sort of policy confusion at the moment, I think, where both parties have been finding it hard to figure out what policy position they want to come forward, that the neoliberalisms to some extent come apart. There's a bit of a move back towards social democracy. The Liberals are still sticking to sort of market mechanisms when it suits them and not when it doesn't. So I think that's also happening, and that fuels, I think, an instability in the leadership.
Alan Jones.
Yeah, well, the question is a very valid question. I personally think that there's tremendous concern out there about the future of the democratic process, whereby the people actually thought that they mattered. But they only seem to matter at election time. And everyone goes around and makes all these grandiose promises. But now people are genuinely worried about their kids when you're heading towards $600,000 million of debt. Or doesn't debt matter anymore? Who's going to start addressing all of this? The revenue comes in. The revenue now is twice it was when Costello left government, and we still can't pay our way.
Alan, now that was a specific question, so it was about...
Well, I'm just saying the democratic issue is people out there watching us think, I don't think people in Canberra at question time or any other time speak about the issues that matter to me. That's their concern, and therefore they're saying, well, what the hell is the use of all of this?
But to back up what Judith said...
I was going to bring Laura in first.
Look, I have a real problem with this. I mean, going back to the question, I think there is this really, really insidious and dangerous trend that did start with the Rudd-Gillard-Rudd period, which has continued. It permeates every aspect of federal politics these days. The mindset that people have, oh, things are wrong, we better change the leader. How did we open this discussion? Oh, things are really bad, let's get rid of the Prime Minister. Well, we can't keep doing this. Why do we, on the one hand, say we've got to get rid of the Prime Minister because, we don't like him or it's not working, but on the other hand say, God, we hate this instability. It affects everything that goes on in Canberra. I'll just give you an example. When people talk about changing a Prime Minister, everybody in the government suddenly goes, oh, well, if Malcolm's going to go in a few months, where does that mean I'm going to end up? Oh, I should be trying to get to the next job. So you don't actually get people making any commitment to the really big portfolio issues that they've got to think about because they're playing the game the whole time. Now, politics is always about playing the game, but it has become awful. Now, whatever you think of Malcolm Turnbull, I reckon that the best thing that could actually happen for the country is that he actually survives till the next election campaign. And then if people don't like him, they can boot him out. And that goes to your point, Alan, which is people want to have control over their own democracy. And even though they might not like him, as was the case with Kevin, it should be up to them to decide when they get rid of him.
I'll just say, a brief response.
30 seconds is this. When I came back as Prime Minister, what was my precondition? That the party changed its rule for the future election of the leader. This was a reform which said, in the future, you can't have a midnight coup. The new rule says it's got to be a 50% ballot from the parliamentary party and 50% from the entire national membership of the Australian Labor Party. Why has Bill Shorten been stable and in his leadership since my rule change?
It's probably your biggest legacy, Kevin.
Well, that's why the factions hate it, because they like to play with this stuff. It's a deliberate defactionalising reform.
Except for the fact that the strongest factional player has ended up on top and he's in no danger. So, in fact, you've put in the ultimate AWU faction man.
Clever debating point, my friend. But here's
happens to be a fact.
Yeah, but hang on. He had to go through a system. He had to get a good vote out of the parliamentary party, which he got. and you had to get a reasonable vote out of the general membership. The point being is you can't just walk in as three sort of, you know, thugsters from faction land at 5 minutes to midnight and say, "Oi, Prime Minister, your job's gone," because I've just had a phone call from a local boss. There is a process, and that's why Bill Shorten has had stability within the leadership. The Liberals haven't done that, which is why we've constantly got this rolling debate about Malcolm Turnbull's future. It's not good for the country.
OK, next question and it's to do with current politics from Henry Heritage.
In light of the recent High Court decision that has ruled out Deputy Prime Minister Barnaby Joyce, the government has subsequently lost their one-seat majority. Despite Mr Turnbull's positive outlook on the situation that politics will continue as usual, does the panel think that the government's control of Parliament has been significantly destabilised, or is this just a temporary setback?
Laura?
I think it is a temporary setback in the sense that there's nothing that the opposition can now do that brings on new legislation. They can create a bit of noise about banking royal commissions, penalty rates, but unless you get two members of the coalition crossing the floor, you can't really do anything substantial to what happens in government. So it's going to be hairy for the next few weeks. If somebody, for example, gets drunk and falls asleep on the couch in their office, like somebody has done in the past, it gets a bit embarrassing. But it is actually quite difficult to actually overturn government decisions or, you know, introduce new legislation in these circumstances. So there is a bit of stability in the system.
Alan, stability in the system. You can't really blame Malcolm Turnbull, I dare say, for the situation he finds himself in at the moment with Barnaby Joyce and his deputy both having to leave Parliament.
No, you can't. But to answer your question, I don't think it alters there's only going to be 1 week of sittings when Barnaby won't be there. He'll win the by-election on December 2. And Tony Smith, the Speaker, does have the right to vote if he so chooses. So the government, the Turnbull government, still have the numbers. What concerns me, though, about the High Court decision, and I remember sitting in front of the television on the date, I think was August the 18th, and Malcolm Turnbull stood up in the Parliament and said, "The Leader of the National Party, the Deputy Prime Minister, is qualified to sit in this House and the High Court will so hold." I just couldn't believe what I was hearing. I mean, this is an issue of judgment. Here was a person virtually dictating to the High Court and to Susan Kiefel what they should do about Barnaby Joyce. Now, the High Court didn't so hold. It unanimously did not so hold, which raises significant questions about the judgment of the Prime Minister. I'm coming back to my point again, the judgment of the Prime Minister. Now, here was Tony Windsor was given the right to be a party to the matter before the High Court. He had Ron Merkel, a former judge, and Justin Gleeson, a former Solicitor General, representing him. Now, presumably, Malcolm Turnbull could have whomever he wanted prosecuting the case that they should stay in the Parliament, and the two people for Tony Windsor wiped the floor with them. Now, what was Stephen Donoghue, the Solicitor General, saying? Or was Malcolm Turnbull heavying him to say to the High Court, these people should stay? Because the reality is all the people lined up to support the Turnbull case that these men should stay in the Parliament, they were thrashed in the High Court by Merkel and by Gleeson. So the question, I think, is not so much is there any instability in the Parliament? There isn't. But further questions about the judgment of Malcolm Turnbull when he made that statement virtually anticipating the High Court decision, and the High Court found the exact opposite of what he argued in the Parliament.
And just a quick question on this. Will the High Court now and other courts begin to overturn or have to consider overturning key decisions that were made with tainted votes from people who were not meant to be members of Parliament?
Well, my understanding is the Labor Party won't be pursuing that, but third parties may. That is, if there are parties, individuals or entities which have been affected by decisions, and of course penalty rates could well be one of them, certain appointments that the government has made while Barnaby Joyce was voting. Because I think what's not commonly understood, under the Constitution, you're entitled to stay in the ministry or in the Parliament for 3 months after your ineligibility is established. Now, given that the High Court established that they weren't even eligible to stand, that 3-month period occurred around about August, and therefore everything that's happened after that is capable of being reviewed. I understand the Labor Party won't be making any kind of legal challenge over those decisions, but third parties may.
Kevin Rudd, should they challenge those decisions?
Well, it hangs on the ultimate legal question based on the High Court's decision as to their inherent challengeability, and there's a mix of legal opinion on this. There's a 1907 precedent which says that, frankly, their ability to challenge such decisions may be marginal. I think that is at a, let's call it a legislative level. At a political level, I think the general perception it creates across Australia with the creation of a minority government, and to go to Alan Jones's point, the mismanagement of it as a judicial process is what sticks in people's minds. And I think that has been pretty crook. And on the judgment question, remember, this is the government that got rid of Justin Gleeson. I mean, Justin Gleeson is a first-class, fine legal mind. If he was in harness, though himself still as Solicitor General of the Commonwealth, I would suggest that the decision of the High Court may have been different. But if you play politics with such a significant appointment as the Solicitor General, God knows where it unfolds to.
Judith?
I was just going to say that Turnbull's comments about what the High Court was going to find were one of the examples I thought of his optimism, rather than him trying to heavy the court. I don't think he would ever try to do that. It was just his sort of optimistic belief that the way he wants the world to be will be the way it is.
Also, we think about his history as a lawyer himself.
You think that would have made him more cautious about second-guessing the High Court?
You'd think so. Well, I mean, I think there are two interesting things here. The first one is, of course, he would have seen the way he approached Spycatcher as him going in and saying, now listen, guys, this is what you should be doing, and probably hoped that the Solicitor General was going to do that in this case, and I suspect he didn't. But I think in all this discussion about who swayed the court, we're overlooking the fact that the Coalition has basically had an own goal here because it's appointed all these black-letter lawyers to the High Court over a period of years. And what have they done? They've handed down a black-letter decision, and we shouldn't really be surprised about that. You know, these are smart people. They can make up their own minds.
That comes to my point, though, doesn't it, Laura? I mean, I just can't believe that Turnbull would make the statement that he made. I don't think it's a matter of optimism, it's a matter of stupidity.
Yeah, but optimism can be stupid.
Oh. All right, let's move on. Let's move on. The next question is from Meredith Knight. Meredith.
Yes, a key promise of the Queensland ALP government is the creation of much-needed jobs in regional Queensland. Premier Anastasia Palaszczuk is relying on assurances from the Indian company Adani that it will create 10,000 jobs through the creation of a mega coal mine in the Galilee Basin. However, this comes at a very high cost in terms of probable environmental degradation, including the already suffering Great Barrier Reef, an exacerbation of global warming. Also, realistic reports have shown that the best case scenario of jobs that this mine will produce is more in the range of 1,500 jobs. Now, Premier Palaszczuk also said that that the government will invest in renewables, which has the potential of creating many more jobs. So isn't it about time that the Queensland government, whatever it happens to be at the end of November, acknowledges that the risk is too great and replaces the Adani mine with renewables?
Alan Jones, I'm going to start with you, and we've got to disclose, first of all... Disclose, first of all, for anyone who doesn't know, that you are the public face of the anti-Adani ads paid for by the Lock the Gate coalition.
I am, and I'm proud of the fact.
Are you a born-again greenie, Alan?
No. I just go on the facts of the matter. There's something very smelly about this, that the federal Liberal government, the federal Labor opposition, the Queensland Labor government and the Queensland Liberal opposition all have got their hands up saying they're going to support this entity. Now, if Indian banks won't lend this mob any money, and the Australian banks won't lend them any money, and the ABC, this station here, has done significant and exhaustive work on the duplicitous behaviour of this Adani mob in transferring monies to the Cayman Islands, and there are significant investigations about this in the Indian courts. Leading members of the Adani family are before the courts in India So I don't understand how we would regard these people as proper people to have the kind of involvement in Australia that they now seek. And yet here are these companies tipping in money to the major political parties, and they obviously believe they're going to secure some kind of benefit. I just find this thing, and you're right about the jobs, that is a complete overestimation of what the jobs might be. The Galilee Basin is central to the Great Artesian Basin, the water supply to outfits like Jericho and others who'd lose their water. It's the source of water for farmers in the region. There's got to be something on here. There's got to be people knocking on people's door with money saying, please vote for us, please support all of this, and they're throwing any amount of money at getting approval. Even if
we'll make a point here. We're not making any specific allegations about money being given to any politicians.
No, money to political parties.
OK.
You know, for example, we oppose developers' money to political parties. Presumably, developers are crook and knocking on doors seeking all sorts of advantages. Well, how come mining money's OK? They can tip it in, and they do tip it in. The little place where I was born, Ackland, is being destroyed. We've fought like hell against all of this prime agricultural land. Why is mining money OK but developers' money isn't? I'm simply saying to the lady's question here, I have the reservations that you have, and I'm not so stupid as not to understand that the money is being tipped into major political parties with a view to getting an end result that they seek, including $1 billion of taxpayers' money, for God's sake, to build a railway line. Why? Well, then when they get the railway line, they believe further mine approvals will be given and they'll make a fortune out of the coal traffic along the railway line. This is smelly, no matter how it's viewed.
We might come back to you on that. Kevin Rudd, is this one of the things that you and Alan Jones might have in common as Queenslanders?
Alan and I have been searching for common ground for almost a decade now.
Oh, dear.
And
you might have found it on this issue.
No, it continues to remain in part elusive. But let me talk about this one. One, on donations, for God's sake. We legislated in 2008 to ban all foreign donations to all Australian political parties. The Coalition refused to support it on 2 occasions. They've been in office now for 4 years. For God's sake, ban foreign donations. Faulkner did the legislation for them. Just do it. Whether it's Indian cash, Chinese cash, I don't care whose cash it is, just do it. Second point, my approach to the mining question, and I'm not across the full brief, I'm out of the country, but what I'd say is this. My starting point, unlike Alan's, is climate change. And whatever we think about what was achieved at the Paris conference, if that is implemented fully, fingers crossed, then that's 1/3 of what is necessary in terms of greenhouse gas reductions in order to keep temperature increases within 2 degrees centigrade this century. And so, therefore, the prism I take on this thing is, for God's sake, when it comes to future coal mines, be very sceptical indeed. And the big danger we see globally, and let's just step back from a bit, not just from Fortress Australia, is that Indian companies, Chinese companies and Korean companies, South Korean companies, represent now 70% of the global investment in new coal mines across the world. Often dirtier, much dirtier than the ones we're talking about up here, but my reservations are about coal, period.
And the final well, just a quick one, is Chairperson Palaszczuk, the Premier we referred to earlier, and a Labor Premier, is she making a big mistake here?
Well, I think it's massively controversial, and the thing I'd not be touching with a barge pole is this business of what Alan referred to before. God, there's 2 things we've agreed on now.
Be careful, Kevin, be careful.
Comrade, is that, no, as follows, is $1 billion from this North Australia Infrastructure Fund is wrong, wrong, wrong. If this thing was to stack up environmentally or commercially it seems not to, then there is no place whatsoever for the federal government to be throwing $1 billion of public funds by way of a possible loan, and then at the same time saying that any government subsidy in the future for renewable energies is simply unsustainable. That's just rank hypocrisy on the core question for the future, which is climate.
Laura Tingle, the question went to jobs, and of course the Mayor of Mackay has been saying that Chardonnay sipping millionaires like Alan Jones, should stay out of this debate completely, and that One Nation's actually stepping into the fray here, and they're likely to win a lot of seats in Queensland in the state election coming up. How is this going to play out politically, this Adani question?
Look, I think it's really, really tricky because the LNP in Queensland is running scared of One Nation. This whole idea of lots of jobs sounds really attractive, but agreeing with both Alan and Kevin, you can't see that this stacks up in any way, shape or form. And the economics of coal are sort of eroding so quickly before our eyes. You can't believe that any politician who's actually going to form a government, as opposed to One Nation who's going to be making trouble, is going to be in a position to be saying, hang on, do we really back this and think that it's going to provide these sorts of jobs and this sort of boost to the economy? It just doesn't make sense. Why they're doing it, you can speculate about, but I don't think it's going to be a positive for anybody who's endorsing it.
See, there's another point here. Kevin's a global warming advocate and I'm not, but just forget that debate for a moment. All of this coal, if you thought that coal was going to be a source of electricity in the future and so on, all of this coal's for export. None of it's for us. They say the economic figures don't stack up. It's not economically viable. It's low-quality coal. The Indians say it's low-quality coal. That's the Indian government has said. But, I mean, why is it that if we have a view that coal will be a source of energy in the future, we are the biggest coal exporter in the world, while here we are chasing energy prices through the roof in Australia? I don't understand, and Kevin, you've been a Prime Minister, why, in the light of what you've said, you've basically said tonight nothing adds up, why are all these political leaders falling over themselves?
Can I just add one thing? I think one of the things that's going on is that some jobs count for more than other jobs, and that we've got a sort of... There's a commitment in the politics of the political parties for some reasons for certain sorts of male blue-collar jobs in the extractive industries to count for more than the jobs in the renewable industry. So that I remember when Tony Abbott was Prime Minister, we're going on and on and on about the loss of mining jobs while he's making decisions which were destroying jobs in renewable energy companies. So...
Plus the fact that most mines now are increasingly automated.
Automated, yes. So
wholly automated, so very few jobs.
Yes, so I don't think we need to believe... I don't believe the figures about the jobs, but it's also... but there's a great deal of symbolic importance. Mining jobs have a symbolic importance that other jobs don't.
I'm going to leave that question that Alan Jones asked as a rhetorical one. We've got so many more from the audience. We'll take those as a comment, Alan. If you've got something to say, join the discussion on Twitter and Q&A Extra on Facebook Live at ABC News Radio straight after this program. Our next question comes from Chloe Humphreys.
This question is for Kevin Rudd. From an outsider's perspective, the majority of America seems to desire the removal of Donald Trump from presidency. As a US resident, do you see the same negativity, or are Americans happy with Trump being in power?
For the first 6 months of this presidency, because I'm the president of an independent, not-for-profit, an American think tank, the Asia Society Policy Institute, which is for 75 or 70 years now been concerned with US-Asia relations, security policy in the region, economic policy in the region, climate policy in the region. That's what we've added. And we do a lot of work on this stuff, working with administrations, both Democrat and Republican. So for 6 months, I've just kind of zipped it up and said, well, that's the American democracy at work. It's a marvellous and at times curious thing.
But I dare say you've read the papers, you've spoken to people, of course, in Harvard and New York. There'd be a very much an anti-Trump feeling from the people you mix with, I dare say. But what about the broad feeling about the country? Do you think he's actually more popular than we believe he is, looking at it from a distance?
I think the general consensus amongst anyone concerned with the public policy process, domestic or international, thinks he's nuts.
That was pretty succinct.
And as I said, I remained silent for the first 6 months. But, for example, just one small example to go to your question. I've spent a huge amount of time as Prime Minister getting America to be accepted as a member of something called the East Asian Summit. And the whole idea was to get the Americans into regional diplomatic institutions concerned about long-term regional security. Prior to that, they were outside. OK, that was 2 years of work. wasn't easy. Finally persuaded the Obama administration to do it, and the rest of the region to say, OK, we'll cop it. And so they have one meeting a year. It's the only multilateral forum which says, get together and we'll talk about regional security from North Korea down. 18 heads of state around the table. And based on what I've just seen out of Washington, this guy's decided not to go. Anyway, that just... People worry about the future role of China in the region. Well, if that is their concern, then for God's sake, this is just an open door for China to be in that conference and to dominate it. As for Tony's other point about how the American body politic feel about it, I mean, you know, because I've been in politics in this country and I look for the resonances, or let's call it the wider one nation factor, in terms of Brexit decisions in Britain, what's happening within the British Labour Party, reacting to the forces of globalisation, which Judith put to before, and Trumpland, which is a region you go to with a certain trepidation in your heart, because it's across so many states in the centre of the United States, full of guns and everything else. There is still 80% support for Trump amongst registered Republican voters. Now, that is the scary thing. For the future, we need action by both the Senate and the House leadership of the Republican Party to rein this president in, maybe finally as well and formally, but they are terrified by the continued support which this guy has out there and anywhere from Alabama to the Midwest.
OK, part of what your answer there leads to the next question, which is a video from Terence Houghton in Henley Beach, South Australia.
Good evening, Kevin. Currently, our regional balance of power is shifting very dramatically, with nations such as China and North Korea asserting themselves in new and, for us, alarming ways. As a former Foreign and Prime Minister, do you think Australia is keeping up with this shifting balance? With an unstable presidency in the US, should we be rethinking the ANZUS alliance with a view to adopting a more independent relationship with our American ally?
Kevin Rudd.
I always believe in dealing with these two giant phenomena, China and the United States, that we Australians should have the smarts, the serious smarts, to walk and chew gum at the same time. You know, the debate we often have in this country is all the way with the USA, e.g. the Iraq War, or it's happily dancing to Beijing's tune, because that's the new global reality. It's a nonsense dichotomy for this country, and we should not allow it to become the dichotomy for this country. It's either one or the other. You know, when I sit down with Chinese leaders, I've done over the years, and they ask, why are you guys American allies? I said, well, one, we became an American ally because of the anti-Japanese war. You guys had something to do with that, because most of the anti-Japanese war in the Pacific happened in China. Actually, didn't happen in the Pacific Islands or on the waters approaching Australia. And secondly, if you were us, and you're 20 million people, one of the longest coastlines in the world, huge continent, wouldn't it make sense if you had an alliance with a country which shared your values?
But I'm just going to pick up the questioner's point, and you've just said the President of the United States is nuts. And I'm asking, if you were Prime Minister, and bearing in mind that you think he's nuts, would you actually try and change the ANZUS alliance, moderate it, or pull Australia away from any commitments that it might make to a war in, let's say, Korea?
The President of the United States does not equal the United States. That's the first point. And we've got to see what happens in 3 years' time. You don't make a single decision about, as fundamental this country's long-term national security, on, shall I say, the unique qualities of the current occupant of the White House. That's the first point. I think the second is this. You know, this alliance never mandates us to do anything that is not in the national security interests of Australia. Why the Iraq War was such an atrocious decision was because no alliance with the United States mandated it. That alliance is a Pacific theatre alliance. It's got nothing to do with the Middle East. And secondly, I've always argued this, and we should too for the future. An alliance with the United States does not mandate compliance with the United States on every item of foreign policy.
Let's go back to the rest of the panel. Judith.
I don't think I've got anything to add.
Laura.
Well, I think whether President Trump is nuts or not, I think he's sort of done us a bit of a service, because because he is a bit nuts, he frees people from this sort of slavery to the idea of the alliance that I think we suffer from. I mean, we are so insecure in Australia. We're always looking for the big brother. And I think there's been a quite profound change in the way policymakers and politicians in Canberra have thought about foreign policy in the wake of Trump. And you're particularly seeing this in the Labor Party at the moment. Penny Wong has been starting to articulate a quite different foreign policy. It's not anti-American, it's not anti-Chinese, but it's actually Australian, and it's focused very much on the region, on India, which is of course a massive growing power as well, and which very rarely gets mentioned. So I think it's actually created this space for nuance in our foreign policy, which we haven't seen for a very, very long time, if at all.
Alan, John Howard referred to Australia as being the United States deputy sheriff in the region, and I'm just wondering, would you be comfortable being the deputy sheriff to Sheriff Trump?
Well, I just find all of this, Kevin, I appreciated your foreign policy dissertation, but I find this extraordinary. I mean, I'm sure there were many people when you were the Prime Minister who thought you were nuts. And I think that many people most probably think Tony Abbott's nuts. But what are we saying to the people of the United States of America? They're all dumbbells. I mean, this bloke Trump, whether you like him or whether you don't, fought everybody. I think he beat 9 mayors and a whole lot of congressmen to win the Republican nomination against everybody in the Republican Party. The media were all against him. Democratic Party was against him. A formidable female candidate. One of the most formidable, I think, that we've seen in history. And Donald Trump has won.
He did have Vladimir Putin on his side.
Well, we've yet to determine. We're yet to determine. That's uncharitable, Tony. We're yet to determine whether that's true. All I'm saying is he has won. Now, he won because there are a whole heap of people, and it's where we started, actually, tonight, the discussion. A whole heap of people felt completely alienated from the political process. He talked about cleaning the swamp. There were unemployed people who couldn't get a job, and Trump appealed to them. Now, the reality is the employment figures are the highest they've been in 43 years. Business seems to think it's OK. The stock market's gone through the roof in America. And to argue this because he's different, that means he's stupid, I don't think the bloke's stupid at all. He's managed to make a quid for himself. He's employed a lot of people. And I don't think it helps our relationships with anybody. So start saying that a democratically elected leader in any country is nuts.
So when we're looking at North Korea, it's a valid point because this is, frankly, looking at a prospect of armed conflict in the peninsula, which is no longer theoretical, but rising to 15, 20, 25%. Therefore, it is time to actually raise the question about whether the president is going to competently exercise presidential powers in such an emerging crisis, which involves a nuclear weapon state.
Which a number of Republicans
very speculative.
Have begun to do.
It's not speculative, Alan. This is a matter subject for discussion in the United States Congress and the United States political system every day. Whether to attack North Korea.
Yeah, well, yeah. Well, I just think the reaction by the rocket man in the last couple of weeks demonstrates that China and Trump most probably have had some very significant success in that area, but they're not going to tell the world about it. You know, when you were Prime Minister, you wouldn't have told the world about the negotiations you were taking. I think that they most probably have that in charge. I think the bloke's got to be given more credit than he's being given. And I don't think it helps us the American people to be telling they're all stupid because they elected a bloke their president.
OK, let's move along. And a reminder that Kevin Rudd wrote a book. The next question is sort of about that. It's from John Fennell.
What was the logical connection there?
Thank you. My question follows on from the theme of factional politics, which, frankly, I think destroyed the Labor Party while you were there, and it's now destroying the Liberal Party that they're in. And what you said was that Wayne Swan only kept his job as Treasurer because of the factionalism and the factional support within the Labor Party. So my question is, who else was in your cabinet that was in that same position that was really not up to the task, in your opinion?
Which I think is a question based on your book.
Yeah. So the reason why I had such an appalling relationship with the factions was because when I became leader of the party, and Julia supported me in this, is that we said that we would select the front bench and we would not do it through a system which had pre-existed by about 100 years, whereby the parliamentary party, for which you now read the faction chiefs, elect the front bench, not elect, appoint the front bench. And because that in the past had served up some pretty mediocre candidates into certain shadow ministerial or ministerial positions. So I wasn't going to cop a bar of it. So I made that plain, and we went through with it. So the decision to retain Wayne Swan in that position was mine, and I accept responsibility for a poor decision in the book. I'm just very open about it. In the back of my mind, what I also say in the book is that I also had a concern that Wayne would have mucked up badly, factionally, had he not been appointed. But I also thought that the Treasury, as they'd done previously brilliantly with Keating, would actually train him up and make him a first-class performer. My final point is this. On the other members of that cabinet, there is, I don't think, any debate that any of them were anything other than first-class performers. And Julia and I actually sat down and we worked it out together. And I think the list is good, and we were always just concerned about whether we'd made the right decision or whether I ultimately made the right decision on Wayne.
Who should you have appointed Treasurer?
Lindsay Tanner. And I had many sleepless nights about what to do. I wanted Lindsay in the finance area, so in the economic policy domain, and he would have been a brilliant treasurer. He was a brilliant finance minister. And by virtue of having his finance minister, he was also party to all the core economic decisions of the government. It was a flawed decision on my part, but in the context of a big reform of the way in which the Labor Party selected its front bench.
But you ended up with the greatest treasurer in the world, according to one very leading economic magazine.
Which one was that?
I think it was Financial Times, I'm not sure.
No, it wasn't. I don't know the name of the magazine, but it's, yeah.
Judith Brett.
I don't have a view on this either.
No, you don't know, so...
I mean, it's Kevin's
You're a historian. I was wondering how you gauge the worth of that cabinet.
Oh, well, I thought it was a pretty reasonable cabinet. I mean, I think on the whole, I mean, I suppose I've been focused on the present, but, you know, Labor has been producing pretty good cabinets. I think the shadow cabinet at the moment is a lot better than the cabinet that we've got. And so I think, however, whatever the system is that they're using to select the cabinet ministers, and I think that was a good reform, but it hasn't lasted, has it?
No, I think...
but, you know, so even though they've gone back to their more factional ways, I think the current Labor cabinet, shadow cabinet's pretty good.
All right, let's move on. We've got another question from Bethany Pankhurst.
This year is 50 years since the 1967 referendum to count Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples. On Thursday, the Turnbull government rejected the Uluru Statement from the Heart, stating that it was unlikely to win acceptance in a referendum. Does the panel agree that Australians are not willing to give constitutional recognition to our First Nations?
Alan Jones, start with you.
Well, look, I hate to be sounding like a cracked record here, but this is another instance where I just think the government has shown an impossibility. They don't seem to be able to prosecute the case. And if there's a mistake on this whole Indigenous issue, it is I do think the whole of the nation, representatives of all the nation, should have been part of the decision-making that was taking place. They had 12 regional councils to look into all of this, and there were only Indigenous representatives. But just put that aside, there has been, and there always will be in the Rudd government, in the Gillard government, the Abbott government, there have been standing Indigenous advisory bodies. Now, as I understand it, all Pearson and co are saying, which is pretty reasonable sort of stuff, the Constitution is altered to mandate the existence of such a body outside the Parliament, not inside the Parliament, and they would then be able to advise the government of the day on matters relating to Indigenous affairs. I don't think that's in any way controversial. We already have it, but all they are wanting to do is enshrine it or mandate it within the Constitution. Now, Turnbull then gets this all mixed up with a treaty. There was talk of a treaty. You can't have a treaty, and Noel Pearson wasn't talking about treaties. And they can't, if you believe in it, You get out and you argue to the public and you prosecute it rather than say, oh, this is all too difficult, we wash our hands of it. Because I don't think what's being proposed is very controversial or very difficult. It's just giving constitutional recognition to what already is in place. The body would be outside the parliament, not inside the parliament, and on Indigenous matters, the parliament would then be able to consult those people. They don't have to agree with them, but they would feel that they had a consultative role within the deliberations of the parliament. I don't think that's very tough.
So a simple and relatively straightforward, easy to argue proposition in your view?
Is simply that, is to simply say, well, we'll alter the Constitution to mandate the fact that there will be a statutory Indigenous advisory body. It won't be binding on the government, but will have the capacity to recommend to the government on all matters in relation to Indigenous affairs. How hard's that?
Laura Tingle, it was pretty amazing that this was kind of tossed out late last week in the middle of all the other crises, particularly about the AWU raid. Some people suggested this was the throwing out the trash phenomenon. In other words, getting rid of something that you didn't want when people were looking elsewhere.
Yeah, it certainly had that feeling to it, Tony, and I think the real disaster of this decision is that it basically, before you even say we're going to have a consultative body, says we're not even going to, we've asked you for what you want, Indigenous Australians, and you're not going to get it. That you're knocking it out straight away. I think this is one of the things. I mean, Malcolm Turnbull is blamed a lot for being too swayed by the conservative parts of his party, and I think this was definitely one of these examples of this, because if we look back to July and the Uluru Statement from the Heart, when that came out, everybody initially was sort of going, oh, well, we weren't quite expecting this, but it doesn't sound too bad. But you might remember within, I think, 12 or 24 hours of the statement emerging, Barnaby Joyce came out and said, well, this isn't going to happen. This could be a veto on mining, it could be all sorts of catastrophic things. And I feel that from that moment on, this was doomed. I think the Prime Minister, whether it was throwing out the trash or not, I think his view of this was, look, this was never actually going to work. It's a nice idea, but constitutionally it wasn't going to work, it wasn't going to work politically, and somebody had to be the bastard and actually just call that. Now, I don't think that's the right call, but I think that's the judgment that Cabinet made.
Let's hear from Judith. Is this another example of what you were talking about earlier about Malcolm Turnbull not appearing to believe in anything enough to prosecute?
Yeah, and it seemed to me, I mean, it happened on the same day as the High Court judgment and the AWU, debacle, whatever we want to call it. And I thought he didn't need to have made a decision. He didn't need to have said anything that day. He could have just waited a bit. Because what seemed to happen was this idea that somehow what was being asked for was a third chamber, which wasn't what was being asked for, got running. And my reading of it was, yes, it doesn't believe in anything, but that with those two blows coming in on the government, that Turnbull just didn't feel he had any political capital left at all, and he wasn't going to use it on this.
Kevin Rudd?
Reconciliation in this country is a delicate process, and it actually requires some really delicate handling, and it requires some strength of leadership to keep it rolling. What struck me just as I came back into the country this week and looking at the way in which this decision was taken and then announced was of itself a deep, I think, insult to the processes of reconciliation that we've set up over a long period of time. Prior to my apology to Aboriginal Australians, including my apology to Aboriginal Australians, and since then. So I would actually call upon Turnbull to just think this one through in terms of the damage you do to something many of us have been spending a long time on to try and get right. And the second one is, you heard it here first on ABC News. I'm on a unity tick with Alan Jones. This is an unremarkable recommendation from the Uluru process, and it, at a minimum, should be listened to with respect. And frankly, it is entirely doable. But at the point at which you kill it and strangle it at birth, and Malcolm says, the National Party are upset, or Tony Abbott's upset, or whoever is upset about it, and then it just dies. This is very damaging. And I think I'll just call upon, wiser counsel to prevail and try to bring this back into a position where maybe it takes a change in government to do this, that we are back on the reconciliation trail, because this takes us right off that trail.
OK, we've got time for one last question. It goes back to the book that Kevin Rudd wrote. It's from An Young.
Yeah. This question is for Kevin Rudd. And did your challenging and difficult childhood contribute to your ultimate success by providing lessons and to some extent solutions to life's problems? Yeah, that's my question.
Oh, okay. Well, thanks for the question. I think a lot of people have a few challenges in childhood. I don't know much about the panel, but yeah, look, I mean, I had actually a very good childhood, first 10 years. On a farm, had a horse, rolled around, lots of animals, you know, chooks, everything. It was good. And then, not uniquely, my father was killed in an accident. I'm sure there's a whole bunch of people in here who lost one of their parents early in life. But these were reasonably bleak times in Australia. There wasn't much by way of what you described later on as social security. So I think it was certainly a fueling experience for me to explore what was just and unjust in life. I came from a non-political family. If mum and dad never discussed politics, they all voted Country Party, they all read the Queensland Country Life, and it was just not on the table for family discussion. But there's something about that in my own case and the impact it had on my mum. I thought, this is just crook, you know, got to do something about it.
Did it leave a kind of anger in you?
Anger/determination that this is just off. You know, when someone loses the breadwinner and there is no money and you don't have anywhere to stay, you should have a society which actually cares for people under those circumstances. So I didn't know what the word social justice was as an 11-year-old. I had never heard of anything called the Labor Party. I never met anyone from the Labor Party. They would have been drummed out of town at least 30 years before. So that was just an early experience. And then, frankly, when I started as a teenager to read about questions of social justice and what you can do through politics to bring about progressive change, I think that was part of it. Not all of it.
I'm just going to interrupt there, because you write that this book is meant as a letter of encouragement to anyone considering a future in public life. So the first question they have to ask themselves is, what do I believe in? Is there a correct answer to that? Because what do I believe in leads to Tony Abbott, it leads to Kevin Rudd, coming from completely different perspectives, changing society in completely different ways.
No, this is, I say at the beginning of the book, this book is intended a letter of encouragement for those seeking to pursue a future in progressive politics. And you're uncertain about some of your beliefs, you're uncertain whether you've got the guts to do it, because there's a lot of scar tissue to be had on the way through. I've had a bit. Or the point that both Judith and Alan have raised this evening, this growing despair across Western democracies as whether politics matters anymore and whether it actually has a capacity to deliver. So my overall message to this book is it does matter. There is a lot of ugliness associated with the process. It's really ugly. And a lot of people get damaged who are part of the process. But you know, if we didn't have predecessors who actually lined up and said, you know, we should have safe working conditions, we should have laws which govern the workplace, we should have a fair wage, we should have a universal health insurance system which we call Medicare, we should have something even called paid parental leave. It's the accumulation of these things over time. So my message to people, including action on climate change, we've now got a mandatory renewable energy target, which takes us from 5% to 20% of total electricity supply. None of these things are perfect, but the cumulative effect of the project over time is a worthwhile one. So hence I encourage young people who have a passion about this, go for it. Don't die wondering.
I'm going to throw to Alan from a different perspective. Did you find a kind of encouragement to become a conservative in your life? What is it? He found this passion to lead a life in progressive politics. You've gone in a different direction, although some evidence tonight suggests you may be twisting around a little bit.
I think that no. I think that people imagine that the gulf is greater than it really is. The one thing I'd just like to say, and I hope you don't feel, Tony, I'm not answering your question. I think the great lesson from Kevin Rudd, you've got to forget whether you agree with policy, whether you're Labor or whatever you are. It's a wonderful statement in Australian life that you came off a dairy farm, you were a share farmer, I came off a dairy farm. It's not a great living there, and you battle and struggle, but you have risen to become the Prime Minister of your country. That is a significant triumph, and for young people who most probably have never experienced all this, there is a tendency today to believe that everything we want will be available to us. Well, another thing that I think Kevin and I have in common is that wasn't the case. My parents died never having had a holiday. I didn't really think we were any worse off as a result. I think one thing that was nice in those days was that the bank manager knew you. He was a person, you weren't referred to head office in Sydney. But for people in Australia who see Kevin Rudd as a bloke from the bush in Queensland, a tragedy of the death of a father, that's not easy in any family. And then you've got to feed yourself, and mum's got to get a job, and he goes to boarding school and doesn't like it. These are good stories, and there are a lot of them. And I just say to young people, believe that you can be whatever you want to be. Actually, don't worry about the politics of it. That will most probably come to you. You'll be imbued with certain attitudes towards life and who's right and who's wrong. But I don't think that's the issue. The issue is to say that don't think that any hill is too high to climb. And I think that's what you established fairly early on, and it's to your great credit that you got to the top of that hill.
Well, before we break into Sound of Music, I'm going to have to end the program here because we're out of time.
Point, Tony.
I thought you were just about to forward every stream. Anyway, that's all we have time for tonight. Please thank our panel, Judith Brett, Kevin Rudd, Laura Tingle and Alan Jones. And remember, you can continue the discussion on Q&A Extra with Tracy Holmes and Pulitzer Prize-winning American journalist David K. Johnston. They're taking comments on ABC News Radio and Facebook Live just as soon as we finish here. Now, next week on Q&A, we'll be encouraging young people to get involved in politics with our second high school special. Hundreds of students auditioned to sit on next week's panel. They were smart, articulate and keen to have their say. Here are the successful candidates.
Hey Q&A, my name's Geordie. I'm from regional New South Wales in Tamworth, giving me a bit of a different perspective on things.
I'm a 16-year-old who represents a rising global wave of conservatism amongst youth.
I have a perspective and point of view on many of the big issues today that has been influenced by both personal experience and independent investigation.
I'm a proud youth activist who believes strongly in young people's ability to influence and discuss and get involved in the social and political affairs of our time.
And that's exactly what they'll be able to do when those 4 students join Education Minister Simon Birmingham and his shadow, the Deputy Opposition Leader Tanya Plibersek, on the Q&A panel. They'll be facing questions from an audience of senior students. So look forward to that. Until next week's Q&A High School special, good night.